G'day there, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you're all enjoying the hospitality so far. Sorry to break up the conversation at the table. That's got to be one of the best behaved crowds I think I've ever emceed in front of, so thank you so very much. Welcome everyone to the Queensland Media Club. I know you're all very much looking forward to today's keynote address. On that note, while you continue to enjoy your lunch today, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker, the Hon Murray Watt, Minister for the Environment and Water and Senator for Queensland. Minister Watt will update the club on the government's most significant national environmental law reforms in 25 years and their impacts on Queensland's environment and its businesses. As we approach the final sitting week of Federal Parliament for 2025, Minister Watt will offer insight into reform negotiations as the government delivers what it's calling fit-for-purpose laws for the future. But before we invite the Minister to the stage, some background. Murray Watt was appointed Federal Minister for the Environment and Water on the 13th of May this year and has represented the state of Queensland in the Australian Parliament since 2016. He has served as Government Minister since the 2022 federal election, having previously held the portfolios for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, Employment and Workplace Relations and Emergency Management, responding to Australia's floods, bushfires and tropical cyclones, all three of which, of course, Queenslanders are all too familiar with. In those roles, Minister Watt led a minimum wage increase for nearly 3 million workers, an overhaul of Australia's preparedness for natural disasters, and improvements to Australia's biosecurity protections. Before the Senate, he was a lawyer, a public servant, and a Chief of Staff to former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh, meaning he has an intimate knowledge not just of federal politics, but also of Queensland politics. No doubt, we look forward to hearing, or I know you're all looking forward to hearing how the Minister's environmental law reforms will strike the right balance between environmental protection and economic progress. A difficult, tricky balancing act, no doubt a tightrope, I imagine the Minister might describe it as, but it is one that is crucial in a state where the environment and the economy are so closely intertwined. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming to the stage the Hon Murray Watt.
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction, Reece. It's nice to see you again. We enjoyed having you down in the Canberra Press Gallery for a little while there, but I know you're doing well back up here in Brisbane as well. But great to see you again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd obviously like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're gathering on today, the Yuggera and Turrbal people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. As we all know, for tens of thousands of years, Australia's Indigenous peoples have cared for the lands, seas and waterways of these regions that we call home, and their knowledge and practices remain valuable to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge my very good mate and a real champion for Queensland's environment, Stephen Miles, the Labor opposition leader, and also to Ipswich Mayor Teresa Harding, who I think has joined us or is shortly joining us as well. Thank you to the Queensland Media Club and its sponsors for the opportunity to speak with you all today at what really is a fork in the road for the environment and indeed for our economy in this state. Most of you might know that by now we are in the final stages of attempting to reform our country's national environmental laws. The Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act, is now 25 years old, and it is time for an overhaul. We're hopefully now reaching the end of a long 5-year journey since former ACCC Chair, Professor Graham Samuel, handed down his reform blueprint to then Environment Minister Susan Lee. Queensland's environment and some of our greatest natural and economic assets are facing ever more pressure from climate change, habitat destruction, and natural disasters. So it's vital that we do all we can to protect the environment and the hundreds of thousands of Queensland jobs that rely on it in industries like tourism, agriculture, resources and more. And right now, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do just that. Now, usually when I give a speech down south, I start by telling a story about one of the great natural wonders of our state that we are so lucky to call home. But I think that introduction is probably a bit redundant in a room full of Queenslanders, because you all know the beauty of the Great Barrier Reef, the wonder of Gari, the vibrancy of Lamington National Park, and that amazing desert country in Western Queensland. Now, my job as the Federal Environment Minister is to ensure that we are protecting these incredibly important sites, as well as protecting our international reputation as a good steward of the environment. But it's also my job to ensure that approvals under the EPBC Act for job-creating, productivity-boosting projects can proceed where appropriate. Now, getting this balance right and achieving both aims, the environment and the economy, was at the core of Graham Samuel's reforms. And it's at the core of the reforms that we intend to pass through the Federal Parliament next week. Now, any honest assessment of our natural environment must acknowledge the pressure that nature is under. Here in Queensland, the most recent State of the Environment report found that between 2019 and 2024, the number of threatened species for Queensland has increased by 48 fauna species and 66 flora species. Now, that's species that Queensland is renowned for, like the koala, which was listed as endangered in 2022, with too many other birds, mammals, and other species threatened with extinction as well. These reforms that I'm here to talk to you about today are desperately needed to shift the dial in favour of our environment. Equally, we've seen project approval times blow out from a median time frame of 48 weeks at the turn of the century to 118 weeks now, costing business time and money and strangling the homes and renewables that we need. So in short, reforming these laws is vital to protect our natural environment on which life depends, as do those jobs in Queensland everywhere from Cape York to Camberwell to Coolangatta. But this Act is also incredibly important to give those of you in the business community certainty and to achieve our national priorities, like building more homes, more renewables, and harvesting the critical minerals that we will need in the future. When I started in this role and embarked on this reform journey, I said that the environmental reform train is leaving the station and that I wanted as many people on that train as possible rather than shouting from the platform as it went by. And I've followed through on that, bringing up well over 120 meetings with key stakeholders, state and territory ministers, the Federal Coalition, Greens and independent parliamentarians. My office and I have consulted everyone from the Queensland Resources Council to the Queensland Conservation Council and countless in between. And that work, I think, has resulted in a balanced package of reforms centring on three key pillars. And they are, firstly, preserving what's precious by strengthening environmental protection and restoration. Secondly, delivering a power surge for productivity through quicker project assessments and approvals. And thirdly, cementing these reforms by enshrining greater accountability and transparency around environmental decision-making. I might just step you through each of those pillars now. Now, there is a reason why the suite of legislation that we've now passed through the House of Representatives is called the Environment Protection Reform Bills, because our national environmental law must protect our environment. And when this bill is passed, it will, with several demonstrable gains for nature. First, the reforms will create a new ministerial power to create national environmental standards, which will be regulations under the Act. These standards were the centrepiece of the Samuel Review, and they will set the boundaries for decisions to ensure they deliver improved environmental outcomes. Importantly, they will also provide certainty and guidance for business by setting clear and enforceable expectations and uplifting the quality and consistency of government decision-making. Professor Samuel made the point that it's vital these reforms don't just protect but restore our precious natural environment. That's why projects will now be required by law to avoid, mitigate and repair damage to protected matters wherever possible. Any residual significant impacts on nationally protected matters must be fully offset to achieve a net gain for the environment which is an improvement on the existing policy of no net loss. A net gain could be achieved either by the proponent directly delivering an offset or through an upfront financial contribution to a new restoration fund managed by an independent statutory officer in my department. We will stop projects that have an unacceptable impact on the environment from happening, and there will be higher penalties for the most significant breaches of environmental law, as well as environment protection orders for use in urgent circumstances to prevent and respond to major contraventions of the law. Now, these are just some of the reform measures that deliver more protection for the environment. But more than that, they start to shift the dial away from simply protecting the environment from harm towards restoring nature towards recovery. The second pillar of these reforms is delivering a power surge for productivity through quicker project assessments and approvals. I know probably many of you in the room have had to go through the pain of seeking an assessment and approval under the EPBC Act. And the reality is, many of those projects are taking far too long, in the system that is. I've already cited some of the figures on the economic cost of delayed projects, not to mention the community impact of slower approvals of housing, renewables and more. So a key focus of our reforms is removing duplication in the federal and state approvals and assessment system for projects, all while maintaining strong environmental standards. The current system, as you may know, requires proponents to navigate multiple assessment and approval processes across federal, state and territory jurisdictions, creating lengthy delays while delivering no benefit for the environment. Our new laws will enhance our ability to enter bilateral agreements with states and territories, which would see them undertake one set of assessments and, over time, approvals against their own requirements and federal standards. Those processes at state and territory level would be accredited and audited by the Federal Environment Protection Agency. And this new system delivers on a key recommendation from Professor Samuel, and it would see proponents go through one assessment process rather than two, in some cases saving years of delay. At a local level, I've had some encouraging discussions on this with the Queensland Environment Minister, and I look forward to progressing them once we get these laws through. Other aspects of the reforms to provide more efficient and robust project assessments include a new streamlined assessment pathway. This will significantly reduce the assessment timeframe for proponents who provide sufficient information up front and provides an incentive to proponents to meet the standards up front. In addition, the reforms will allow for the greater use of regional planning. Under this approach, the federal government can work with other levels of government, industry and communities to identify upfront what we might call go zones and no-go zones in a particular region. What that means is that projects in areas of low environmental value would be able to be approved much more quickly, and it also gives clarity on areas where development is unlikely to proceed because of its high environmental value. Again, we've begun pilots of this new approach with the Queensland Government across the state, focusing on housing development, wind farms and mining, and we're keen to do more. The third and final pillar is cementing these reforms by enshrining greater accountability and transparency in decision making. Currently, the community lacks confidence in decisions made about the environment and in whether our laws are properly enforced. If these reforms are to endure in the long term, we need to rebuild confidence in decisions made under the Act. Critical to this task is the establishment of a new independent watchdog which can enforce those laws. Now, Labor has gone to the last two federal elections promising to create Australia's first ever independent national Environment Protection Agency, and we intend to deliver on that promise. The new national EPA would be a cornerstone of the environmental law reforms, ensuring independent compliance and enforcement and delegated decision making. In line with the recommendations of the Samuel Review, the EPA would have access to stronger new powers and increased penalties to better protect and restore Australia's precious environment. Under current laws, decision-making on project assessments and approvals is the responsibility of the Minister, who is democratically elected. and that system will not change through our reforms. And I note that preserving the ministerial responsibility for decision-making is agreed by all parties, including the Coalition and the Greens. So we've at least got agreement on one point. The creation of a national EPA by the Albanese government is a huge step forward to lock in protections for nature and builds on Labor's strong environmental legacy. We're also delivering on Professor Samuel's recommendation that the Act should better harness and value First Nations knowledge about supporting healthy country built up over 60,000 years. The reforms will codify the involvement of First Nations people via our Indigenous Advisory Committee into the Commonwealth's environmental governance and decision-making, including in the development of the new National Environmental Standards. Finally, the reforms also introduce new emissions disclosure requirements. In keeping with Professor Samuel's recommendations, we haven't included a climate trigger in the legislation. Rather, the reforms will require major emitting projects to disclose estimates of Scope 1 and 2 emissions as part of gaining federal environmental approval. This will provide a clearer linkage to climate-related policies such as the safeguard mechanism, but those disclosures will not be taken into account in project approval decisions. Now, many commentators and politicians want to frame this legislation and everything to do with the environment as a tug of war between the environment and the economy. And I think they assert a false choice, that you can have one but not the other. This is plain wrong. You don't have to choose between the environment and jobs and the economy. We can protect and improve our environment while removing that duplication and speeding up project approvals, and that was the secret sauce of Professor Samuel's report. In the same way that most of us have moved beyond the notion that you could act on climate change or have jobs, we have to move beyond this false choice when it comes to nature. And that is the path that I'm trying to navigate in getting these laws passed through the Senate next week. I might mention just in passing, when I first came into this role, I said that we'd get these reforms done in the first half of the term, and then we decided we'd introduce the laws this side of Christmas, but the imperative to get moving is so great for nature and business that we absolutely want to pass these through the Senate next week. Now, I know there's a lot of interest in who we're going to do a deal with. I expect probably a few questions from our friends up the back about that. And the truth is that I'm still currently negotiating with both sides, the Coalition and the Greens. I've now met with the Coalition's and the Greens spokespeople 6 or 7 times each, and that will continue. I've said from the moment that I took on this portfolio a few short months ago that we are prepared to pass reforms to our national environment laws with either the Coalition or the Greens.
Minister Watt, why am I getting wrestled off this? What is doing in the out of these negotiations? Minister Watt, you're going out of march.
So as I say, I have said all along that we are prepared to pass reforms to our national environment laws with either the Coalition or the Greens. I'm getting to know those couple of people quite well over the last couple of months. It's a democracy, we're all entitled to our say. So I have said that we will pass these reforms with either the Coalition or the Greens. I've also said that I'm a realist when it comes to getting legislation through the Senate, and I recognise that we'll need to make some amendments to get it through. But be in no doubt whatsoever, we will be passing these reforms next week, and it's now up to the Coalition and the Greens to decide whether they want to get on board. If we can't pass the laws with one side, we'll do it with the other. It's as simple as that. Now, for those of you in the room who want to see us do a deal with the Coalition, you need to speak to them and get them to focus on the needs of Australians, including environmental law reform, rather than focusing on who's going to be the next leader of the Liberal Party. I've said all along that my biggest concern about working with the Coalition on this is whether they can stop their infighting and focus on these reforms and the value they provide to the business community. Australians want us to focus on their needs, not who gets to sit in the big chair. So there's a really big opportunity here for the Coalition to, just for 1 week, put aside their leadership turmoil and focus on the real benefits that will come from these reforms. And equally, on the Greens side, it's up to them now to decide whether they want to make progress for the environment or just keep protesting and grandstanding as they normally do. I think everyone here is well aware of the Greens Party's history of blocking positive and progressive reform, like more housing and these very environmental reforms last term. And here in Brisbane, the Greens Party paid a very big political price at the last election for making the perfect the enemy of the good. They have a chance now to show that they've heard that message. So both sides need to put aside the political games for the next week and help us deliver a balanced set of reforms that produce real steps forward for both the environment and for business. Of course, this is not the only environmental issue in the public debate at the moment. There's also climate change and net zero. And part of the hard work of government is to ensure we're ready for the challenges and opportunities of the future. And while acting on climate change is certainly a challenge, it's also an opportunity to protect our environment for future generations, just as it's an economic opportunity for a country that has bountiful sunshine and wind. Already, we see thousands of new jobs being created as part of the transition towards cheaper, cleaner energy. And most of those new jobs are in regional areas, including right here in Queensland. And that's why it's so baffling when politicians who claim to represent the regions are the loudest in seeking to block those opportunities, like senior members of the LNP, including Queensland Senator Matt Canavan and his mentor Barnaby Joyce, who've now not just driven the policy of the National Party, but are also driving the policy of the Liberal Party and the Federal Coalition. The Liberals' humiliating handover of climate and energy policy to these anti-renewable zealots who still debate whether climate change is real is like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. It's hard to think of a more anti-Queensland policy than the Federal Coalition's decision to walk away from net zero emissions by 2050, something that is supported by everyone from the Business Council of Australia to the Minerals Council of Australia and the National Farmers Federation, let alone environmental groups. Now, I'll just quickly take you through the 3 reasons why this decision to walk away from net zero, if it was ever implemented, would hurt Queensland and Queenslanders. First, it would condemn us to higher power prices at a time when Queenslanders want them to fall. The issue we face as increasingly unreliable and expensive coal-fired power reaches the end of its life is how we build the energy grid needed to replace it. And we have a choice about the technologies that we use to do so. On the one side, we can use renewables backed up by gas, batteries and hydro, which every credible scientific and economic expert, including the CSIRO and the Australian Energy Market Operator, tells us is the cheapest form of new power available. Or, on the other hand, we can do what the Coalition say. Their ideological opposition to renewables means that they want to sign Queenslanders up to higher cost forms of power like coal and nuclear. Let there be no mistake, the Coalition's pathway means higher power prices still for every Queensland household for decades to come. The second reason they're wrong. Higher energy costs in this form will sacrifice thousands of jobs across Queensland, especially in our regions. We know that heavy industry is struggling with higher energy costs, but the Coalition's answer is to burden them with even higher cost power, risking more closures and more lost jobs. It also denies business the opportunity to grab international markets and the jobs that come with it by converting to the cleaner fuel sources that their customers internationally are demanding. In key Queensland industries like agriculture and resources, world markets are demanding low-emission products, and the Coalition pathway puts that at risk. To give you one example, Rio Tinto's massive Boyne Island aluminium smelter in Gladstone is right now converting its huge 24/7 power needs to renewables, powered by a new solar farm just up the road. And they're not doing it because Rio Tinto's executives are closet greenies, but because they want cheaper power and because their international competitors are also switching to cleaner renewable power. If we follow the Coalition and do a U-turn away from renewables, the rest of the world will simply pass us by and steal those very industries and jobs that they produce. Thirdly, the Federal Coalition's decision exposes Queenslanders to more frequent and more intense natural disasters. We are the most disaster-prone state in the country, with floods, cyclones, storms and bushfires wreaking havoc, taking lives and costing billions of dollars every year. More than any other state, Queenslanders live the reality of climate change every single summer, and it's now starting earlier. And despite us knowing that climate change will drive even more disasters, the Federal Coalition has just told Queenslanders that they don't care. Now, the only question now is when this merry band of climate deniers will bring their high power price crusade to the Queensland LNP. And there was a bit that went on in State Parliament along those lines yesterday. To date, Premier David Crisafulli has helpfully maintained a commitment to net zero by 2050. But there are worrying signs that his commitment is not shared by his colleagues. We've seen his government cancel wind farms after listening to AI-generated submissions that cited fake wind farms and so-called reports from organisations that don't even exist. Of course, short-sighted decisions like this put a big "not open for business" sign on Queensland's front door. And they only make it harder for the Queensland government to reduce power bills or achieve their own emission reduction targets. And that's before their Canberra-based colleagues come north for their summer recess, ready to strike out support for net zero from their state colleagues' platform. Now, I can tell you, the Albanese government won't be distracted by the circus we see in the Federal Coalition. We will listen to the science, the economic evidence, and the desire of Queenslanders for cheaper, cleaner power. Now, I know there is much more that we need to do to reach our energy and environmental goals, but it is clear that Labor is the only party that's ready to face the challenges head-on to achieve them. We're the only party with a plan to reduce energy prices, reduce emissions, and to capture the jobs and economic opportunities that cheaper, cleaner energy will bring. So in conclusion, with our national environmental law reforms ready to pass the Senate next week, we really are on the precipice of something special. Something that's been 25 years in the making and has taken a lot of hard work from a lot of people. Something that our environment, business and our community desperately need to be done. Not in another 5 years, but now. By this time next week, the Parliament can come together to pass laws that will start restoring our environment, lift productivity, and deliver the homes, renewables and critical minerals that we need, and we need the support of either the Coalition or the Greens. The Coalition have a chance to show they care about the environment, notwithstanding their net zero decision, and that they care about the future prosperity of this country. The Greens Party have a chance to show they've learned the lessons of the past and that they won't block meaningful reform in the search for perfection. Every day we delay these important reforms means more destruction of habitat and time and money wasted by business. So let's get these laws passed so we can build a better future for our country and its greatest state right here in Queensland. Thanks very much.
All right. Ever have a protester while you're in the Employment and Workplace Relations portfolio, Minister?
I did, but they tended to be from the other side of politics. I seem to attract portfolios where there are people have strong opinions, but that makes life interesting.
You said in your speech, action on climate change is certainly a challenge. My first question is it more of a challenge now that the Queensland government has effectively extended the life of coal-fired power in the Sunshine State?
Look, I still feel really confident at a national level that we can achieve the emission reduction targets that we've committed to and recently lifted, that we can achieve the renewable energy targets that we've committed to. It's a little known fact, but in the last month, we saw Australia for the first time reach 50% of our power needs being met by renewable power. So it's now a majority. It's never happened before. So we are making good progress just as we are on emission reduction, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And, you know, I do think the reality is that when state governments make decisions to slow down that transition and to as they say, sweat assets that are reaching the end of their lives and are becoming less reliable and more expensive to run, that does put at risk not just those emissions targets, but also it means that Queenslanders pay higher power prices with all of those impacts on jobs that I was talking about. So, we would really like to see the Queensland government make serious commitment towards meeting its targets, towards supporting that transition, not just for environmental reasons, but that's good for the Queensland economy, especially in regional Queensland.
You mentioned those Commonwealth emissions reductions targets are now at risk, I think were the words you just used. Is it still possible to hit those targets with this new energy roadmap here in Queensland?
I think it's definitely still possible. We're under no illusions that this will be a really challenging task to hit those emissions reduction targets. We're confident that we are very much on track to achieve the 43% emission reduction target by 2030 that we committed to before we were first elected. It will take a lot of work to achieve the new targets of 62 to 70%. But again, we are making good progress on that front. It's partly about the renewable transition. Since we were elected in 2022, our government has approved now over 100 renewable projects, solar farms, wind farms, batteries, and they're starting to come online. You will have seen some of the changes we've made to emission standards for vehicles to move Australia from having what is, in world terms, a pretty dirty and polluting car fleet towards cleaner and electric vehicles and other low emission vehicles. So there's a lot more to be done, and I'm confident we can get there. It does make the job harder when Queensland government and any other state government decides to start backing away from those transitions.
I'll defer to my colleagues at the media table now for their questions. Hello.
Hi Minister, Alex Brewster from the ABC. You touched on it in your speech, but a couple of renewable projects in Queensland have been scrapped. That's as a result of new laws which put community consultation at the start of the approval process. How then do your new federal laws work with what's in place at a state level?
Yeah, I absolutely not just accept but support the need for good community consultation around all projects, whether they be renewables or other projects as well. And there's obviously a social licence issue there for proponents of projects to make sure that they don't alienate local communities. So that is important, and that will be part of our reforms as well. I think it's disappointing, though, if you see state governments, in this case Queensland, as I said, relying on AI-generated submissions that have fake information in them as the justification for cancelling projects. That just demonstrates that the decisions are not being made on the basis of science or good evidence, but they're being made to satisfy certain audiences. I think what we would see is that our reforms would work in combination and in partnership with state processes. I did mention that one of the reforms that we want to get through to speed up approvals of projects is effectively to give states more power to be doing the assessments and over time approvals of projects as well. But in any agreements that we reach with state governments, we want to see them using evidence rather than AI-generated fake information.
G'day Minister, Julius from the Brisbane Times. Last week Ken Henry was in Brisbane talking about loopholes in deforestation that he thinks are not closed by these reforms. Do you have plans to close those loopholes, or do you think these reforms go far enough?
I'm certainly aware of Ken's views and the views of many environment groups and Queenslanders that they would like to see change when it comes to agricultural land clearing. I've met with Ken several times through this reform process, and he's certainly made those views known to me. I guess where we've been coming from with these reforms is very much trying to deliver the recommendations of Graham Samuel's review, which went to a range of matters that needed to be done for environmental protection, as well as speeding up those processes. Graham Samuel didn't address the point of land clearing in his report, and so, as I say, my focus has been delivering his recommendations rather than some of the other issues that people have been raising. We're not going to get every environmental issue solved in one piece of legislation, but I'm certainly aware that there are groups, including people in the room, who would like to see more action on land clearing, and I'm sure they'll continue raising those points.
Good day, Minister. My name is Leah Lowonbu. I am a Vanuatu student, a journalist at Griffith University, and I wanted to ask about the decisions that Australia is taking in terms of gas, more investment into gas in Australia. We've seen the recent ICJ decision on the obligations of countries in terms of climate change. How would you justify these decisions on gas in Australia to the people of Vanuatu?
Thanks for the question and welcome to Australia. I can see you're with Stefan, who's got a very long history in the Pacific as well. You would be aware that our government's worked really hard to repair and strengthen relationships with nations in the Pacific after a pretty bleak time the 10 years previously. And we're certainly very conscious of the concerns of not just Vanuatu, but Pacific nations generally around climate change. You know better than me the impacts that it's having on Pacific nations right now. It's one of the reasons that we were supporting hosting COP. And you may have seen in the news today that Turkey will hold COP, but we have secured what we think are some very good outcomes for the Pacific as part of that process. On your specific question, as I said, our government is absolutely committed to transitioning to renewable power as quickly as we can. But the reality is that to meet our power needs, there does need to be technology to back up that renewable power. And at this current state in time and the foreseeable future, that's going to involve a combination of gas, batteries and hydropower. We can't sort of switch to fully renewable overnight, and there does need to be that transition, and we do think that gas has a role in that transition. But please don't be under any doubt about our commitment to move towards renewables as quickly as we can. As you know, there are people within Australia who think we're moving too fast on that front. But you know, apart from the reasons I gave you around higher power prices and the jobs that renewable power can generate, it's also because we do owe it to the Pacific family to think about the fact that some of those islands are going underwater. So we're trying to have that kind of balanced approach, pushing renewables as hard as we can while making sure that we do have the other sources needed to make sure that the lights stay on.
Hi Murray, Stefan Armbruster, working for the Torres Strait Islander Media Association. And just to follow up on Leah's question and talking about Australia's Pacific Islanders, the Torres Strait Islanders, they're returning to the federal court with the Australian climate case brought by Pabai Pabai and others, armed with the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on states' responsibilities in terms of climate change and hitting the 1.5 target. As a human rights lawyer, and as Minister, do you welcome the appeal by Pabai Pabai on the Australian climate case? And what advice would you give them?
Free advice.
Well, thank you for acknowledging my past glories, such as they were as a lawyer. Obviously, these days I'm the Federal Environment Minister. And I think it would be a little unusual for government ministers to either welcome or publicly shout down cases that people choose to bring. Obviously, people have made a decision that they would like to bring that litigation, and that's their right. We've taken a different position in that case. Again, more broadly, the question, I guess, is what do we need to do as a country and as a world to protect Torres Strait Islands, Pacific Islands from going underwater in the way that they are at the moment? I think a lot of Queenslanders aren't aware that this is happening now in some Torres Strait Islands, and we need to take action. The way we've chosen to take action is by that, moving towards renewables as quickly as we can. Some of the other matters that I've mentioned around vehicle emissions, agriculture change, to reduce our emissions. And as you would know, the way the world has decided to deal with climate change through the Paris Agreement is that every country needs to take responsibility for the emissions that it generates. So the cars we buy from overseas, the mines we operate here, and we're doing everything we can to reduce our emissions while working with other countries to help them reduce their emissions as well.
Hello, Minister. It's Rosanna from the Courier Mail. At the 2022 election, Mr Albanese promised that power bills would fall by $275, but they haven't as of yet. When will Queenslanders see a lower power bill as a result of your government's renewables rollout?
Well, what I can certainly say is that at the federal level, we're doing everything we possibly can to provide Queenslanders with relief on their power bills as quickly as we can. We've obviously had the energy rebate in place, which I know Stephen Miles also had until it was taken away recently. But more than that, this is why that transition towards renewable power is so important. You know, as I was saying in my speech, I mean, one way to think about it is that if you went and bought a derelict house or a house that was reaching the end of its life and you decided you had to rebuild that house, one option is that you choose older materials from a couple of decades ago that aren't as modern, that aren't as efficient, that aren't as cheap. You could do that and you'd pay a lot more. Or you could choose more modern, more efficient, cheaper materials to build that house and save yourself a lot of money in the process. And that's the situation we face with the energy grid. Whether we like it or not, our coal-fired power stations are reaching the end of their lives. Not as quickly as in other states, but they are reaching the end of their lives. And we know that we're going to need more energy in the future, not less, with data centres and all sorts of other things coming online. So the decision we've got is, do we build that new energy grid using old technology that is more expensive and less reliable, which some people want us to do, or do we choose the newer, cheaper, more efficient technology that renewables provides, backed up by gas and batteries and hydro? And we think that's the way to go because, as I said, every credible expert tells us the only way we're going to deliver power price relief to Queenslanders and keep those jobs in heavy industry that rely on energy is by doing that transition, not sticking our heads in the sand, not doing a U-turn to satisfy our political base, but by actually focusing on what will deliver the outcome we're looking for. So that's what our plans are going forward.
It sounds, if I could just jump in very quickly there, we asked the Treasurer David Janetzki whether his energy roadmap would lead to cheaper power bills for Queenslanders. He said he couldn't promise that. He noted the Prime Minister can't promise that. It doesn't sound like you can promise that, despite Chris Bowen and others' earlier promises. Are voters supposed to be satisfied with the fact that it's a contest of who can make power prices rise the least rather than who can make power prices not rise at all?
I think, you know, I absolutely acknowledge the frustration and the financial difficulty that rising power bills are having on Queenslanders. There's no doubting about it. And whenever I get out there in the community, I hear about it. And I think we do need to accept and acknowledge that over the last couple of years, not just Australia, but the world as a whole has gone through energy price spikes that we haven't seen for a very long time. Australia wasn't immune to that, and that inevitably had an impact on power prices in a way that no one could have foreseen. But as I say, the question, I think, is what we do about it moving forward. And in an environment where we are going to need new energy and more energy, do we choose the cheaper option that's very effective, very reliable, that is also a lot cleaner, or do we choose the more expensive option? And I reckon if I took a straw poll on the Queen Street Mall, I reckon I know which way people would go.
And defer back to the table. Sorry, Rosie.
No, all good. Rosanna Kingston from Channel 7 Minister. You acknowledge that the Premier has maintained a commitment to net zero despite what you say are worrying signs from his colleagues. During the state election, we also saw debate around whether the LNP in Queensland would wind back abortion laws, and the Premier found a way to effectively stop any of that debate. What makes you think that he wouldn't be able to find a way to stop an ideological debate when he has said it's important the party not be distracted by ideological issues?
Look, I've seen those comments from Premier Crisafulli, and good luck to him. But the fact is that the revolt in the federal coalition around net zero was led by people out of Queensland. So in my experience, well, actually there are some politicians who say one thing in Queensland and say another thing in Canberra. They don't tend to have a lot of credibility. But in my experience, these characters, if they're going to be demanding that the federal coalition changes their net zero policy, I can't see why they would stop when they come back over the border.
Minister, understanding the federal coalition has a lot going on right now, do you concede that the Queensland government, though, is almost the blueprint for success? We're seeing their adult crime, adult time policy replicated in Victoria. So do you think they deserve any plaudits?
You'll be surprised to hear that I'm not in the habit of giving too many character assessments of state governments. I mean, you would have seen in my speech I primarily focused on the federal coalition. I'll leave it to Stephen and his very capable team to level their assessments of the Queensland state government. What I want as a Queenslander is a government that delivers for Queenslanders. And I think that there are some areas that we really need to see some serious thinking by the Queensland government. And I guess today what I'm focusing on is energy prices and that net zero transition that we desperately need as a state. If we don't do it, it's not just about finding ways to bring power prices down. It's about the opportunities that we'll miss as a state. We are so lucky as a state. We've got the sun, we've got wind, we've got minerals, we've got a highly skilled population. We are set to take advantage of the net zero transition and the billions in exports, the hundreds of thousands of jobs that can produce. And I just don't want to see any Queensland government, turn that opportunity down. I think we would regret it forever. So I hope they have a change of heart on some of these things.
Back in your realm as a Minister of the Federal Government, you mentioned you were anticipating a question about the negotiations that will take place to get the bill through the Senate. You mentioned you're talking with the Greens, talking with the Coalition. I'm interested to know who's demanding less at the moment.
Oh, they're both very demanding, Reece. No, look, I think as the number of meetings have gone on, we have been able to narrow the issues that are of concern and that are in dispute. You'll be surprised to hear that the Coalition want changes made that in their eyes benefit business, and the Greens want changes made that in their eyes benefit the environment. And this is why I keep making the point. We don't have to choose one or the other. What we should be looking for is a balanced package that delivers for both the environment and for business. Now, I think the package we've introduced and passed through the House of Reps does that. In the end, we will probably go with whichever of the sides available is prepared to come closest to that package that we introduced to the Parliament. We put a lot of thought into that package. So there is an incentive to both sides to not put in ridiculous demands, because there is another option for us to go with on the other side of the chamber. As I say, and I've been in the media in the last few days about this, I am really concerned about the Coalition's ability to focus at the moment. If you look back since the election, almost every story involving the Federal Coalition has been about their leadership, and rather than the sort of challenges we're trying to deal with nationally. So it is really important that they focus over the next few days, and again, there may be an opportunity for people in the room to speak with them about that. But equally, I don't know whether the Greens have learned the lesson of the last election yet. There are people in their party room who are more interested in a fight than an outcome. So I hope that the saner forces there prevail if we do end up going that way.
Back to the table if there are any further questions.
Just on COP, like you say, we've got some wins for Australia and the Pacific despite not hosting it. But is there missed opportunities for investment in renewables by the fact that it's not going to be in Australia next year?
Look, we obviously fought very hard to host the COP in partnership with the Pacific, and I really want to pay tribute to Chris Bowen in particular for his incredible efforts that he's put in over a long period of time. You would understand, I'm sure, the system for choosing who gets to host COP. It's not a vote. For some strange reason, we're in the Western Europe and others group. I guess we're the others, along with our friends in the Pacific. And it's a consensus based decision. If any country within that group decides to veto a bid, then it goes back to Bonn in Germany, which no one wants to see happen. In particularly, the German government doesn't want all of a sudden to have to host a massive conference with like less than 12 months' notice. So I guess what we've tried to do is, we've argued as hard as we possibly can. We've spoken about the decision we've taken with Pacific leaders. And as a result of that, what we have been able to extract is for Chris Bowen representing Australia to be the COP president when it comes to negotiations at the COP that will be held in Turkey. And what that means is that the issues that matter to Australia and the Pacific will be front and centre at that COP, even if it's not being held here. We've also managed to secure an additional COP event to be held in the Pacific, which we would hope that many world leaders can attend, because that was the point really of trying to do it in partnership with the Pacific, was to put these very real issues that are facing the Pacific on the international stage. So we think that what we've been able to secure is a good way of doing that. And coming back to your question directly about renewables, you know, whether we're hosting the COP or not, the Albanese government will do everything we possibly can to attract international investment and domestic investment in renewables for all of the reasons that I've explained: the jobs, the power prices, the emission reductions that come from it.
We've got time for one more, I think, team.
Minister, by how much will power bills fall under your policies compared to the coalition?
Well, I'm not going to give you a precise dollar figure, and I notice that when Susan Lee outlined her so-called plan a few days ago, she has made a promise that electricity prices will fall, but when every journalist asks her how, she sort of wraps up the press conference because there is no answer. What we will do is continue focusing on the evidence that comes from the CSIRO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and every credible expert, that the cheapest way we can provide power in the future is renewables backed up by gas, batteries and hydro. And we'll leave it to other people to go out and argue why Queenslanders should pay more for their power rather than less.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking the Honourable Minister Murray Watt.